All right, good morning, everybody. I think we're going to have a little bit lighter group just because of the nicer weather that we've been having, which is great for getting on anhydrous and getting a lot of that stuff done. I was out driving and saw quite a bit of field work going on yesterday, so that's a really good thing to get done this time of year, and hopefully we'll continue to have that window before it closes up and we can get a lot of that fall nitrogen, P and K, lime, all of that stuff on and get through that season. Like always though, guys, we will be recording this, so if anybody misses any of these, they can easily go back and re-watch the recordings. We are sending these recordings out to the Winfield United sales group, and they will forward them out to you. We are also loading these onto our YouTube channel. And so if you guys want to be able to access all of the recordings in one place, we are going to be locating them onto the Iowa Winfield United YouTube channel as well. So you can go through and watch any of those previous sessions on that as well. So as always, guys, feel free. I'll be watching this chat. Feel free to jump in there, ask any questions. I will get to as many of them as I possibly can. And even if it takes me just a little bit to answer the question, know that I am watching that side of the screen. So I do see them, but sometimes the questions fit a little bit better in a different portion of the presentation. So I might jump around just a little bit on that. Today, we are going to cover the last of the herbicide groups. Darren spent some time last week going through groups 1 through 5 and maybe hit a little bit on 6, although 6 isn't nearly as utilized as what some of these other groups are. Today, we're going to focus on groups 9, 10, 14, 15, and 27, which are some of our more common herbicide groups that we use in corn and soybeans, and even somewhat in alfalfa. Okay, and a lot of this stuff, guys, with the herbicides in particular, we're going to spend some time, and I'm sure Darren did as well, going through how does the herbicide work. Now, some of you guys might think, well, God, Tyler, I don't really care how this herbicide works as long as the weed is dead, right? The reason that we spend time going through how the herbicide works is because it's important in understanding how we can improve that herbicide performance. Okay, when we went through the herbicide basics section, we talked about herbicide resistance and how aggressive that can be. Okay, so you want every single molecule of that chemistry to do as much work as we possibly can. And so part of that is understanding how the herbicide works, how it works in the plant, how it moves in the plant, and how it ultimately kills the plant. Because if we know that, we can improve how we apply that herbicide, we can improve what we apply that herbicide with. All of those things can help us get a better understanding of how we can improve our herbicide performance. So we will spend some time on how the herbicide actually works, okay? All right, we're gonna start in on group 9. Most of you guys are very familiar with group 9, so we're not gonna spend a whole lot of time on it, but it is important to understand how it works. So this would be glyphosate, and that is the only group in this, or only common name in this would be glyphosate. Of course, there's quite a few different trade names and quite a few different premixes as well. Okay, glyphosate is one of the most utilized chemistries in agriculture here. It's actually one of our safer chemistries as well that we utilize as well. Okay, the site of action, it inhibits the EPSP synthesis, which forms an enzyme and eventually forms that aromatic amino acid. Okay, so basically what this is doing is it's shutting down the ability of the plant to form tryptophan, triazine, and phenylalanine, which I'm not very good at saying. Okay, those are really, really important in protein synthesis and biosynthesis here, or biosynthetic pathways. So if we do not have this, we won't be able to, first of all, build new growth, because we really need proteins to continue with growth, cell growth and development, but we also won't be able to maintain the cells as well. Okay, and that's why we see with this one that we see that new growth die first, because the new growth needs a lot of protein, needs a lot of these biosynthetic pathways to try to get that plant continually growing. Okay, and so we see this mostly in the new growth first. Now, this is what we consider non-selective herbicide, which most of you guys know. So it kills pretty much everything, although water hemp has been a little bit tough lately, but it is non-selective. Okay, and that's why you need to have the herbicide trait in there so that it doesn't kill the crop. Now, one thing I will tell you guys, as much as we've had some people make the mistake of thinking that glyphosate, for example, is not all that effective anymore, and they don't get the sprayer completely cleaned out when they go to a non-Roundup crop. Guys, understand that non-Roundup crops, especially seed corn, are very, very sensitive to glyphosate. It doesn't take hardly any glyphosate to kill non-Roundup ready crops. Okay, and it's interesting because actually at first when I look at the damage, it almost looks like an HPPD inhibitor at these really low rates. It'll actually somewhat bleach, for example, seed corn. And so generally with seed corn, only the male row is not Roundup ready, whereas all the female rows are. And when they cross-pollinate, then you get the Roundup gene on the female side. And so when you see this, what you'll see is usually the male rows will be killed off. Okay, so it's really, really important to clean out that sprayer properly before you go to a non-Roundup ready crop. Okay, think of it like dicamba for soybeans. That's how particular you need to be when cleaning out a sprayer for glyphosate to go to a non-glyphosate crop, especially for corn. Corn is very, very sensitive to glyphosate. Also, key characteristics, glyphosate is very tightly bound to the soil particles, so there really is no root uptake with this. Okay, it was kind of funny, a couple of years ago, I started getting calls, and we had somebody in the area claiming that glyphosate applied the previous year was damaging their Liberty beans the next year. Okay, and really what it was, it wasn't the fact that you were actually seeing physical damage. What it was is their Liberty soybeans weren't performing yield wise, and so they were blaming it on the glyphosate the previous year. Okay, glyphosate is bound very tightly to the soil particles, and therefore it does not get taken up by the root. Okay, and even when it comes off these soil particles, it is rapidly broken down in that soil. Okay, so I'm not concerned about carryover, not concerned about root uptake there. Okay, glyphosate is translocated down to the roots, and actually it comes back up through the phloem. This is why it does take a fair amount of time for glyphosate to kill a weed. Okay, usually about 10 to 12 days before you start seeing symptomology. You can see the effect that this has. Okay, so in this picture, you'll see how glyphosate actually kills the plant. Notice that it's going to be on the new growth first. Okay, you can already see it on the Class Act. By the way, this is the reason we recommend Class Act NG versus just AMS with a surfactant, because we get a lot better control with that. You can see though that basically you kill off that new growth first, and then it's that old growth that comes and dies after that. Okay, but it took about 10 to 14 days to really start seeing that damage start to occur. It's always going to show up in that new growth first. Okay, so here's what it looks like out in the field. Basically, you just have necrotic tissue in that growing point first. And so that's where you're going to see the damage there. Now, there's a couple different ways that weeds have gotten around glyphosate tolerance or glyphosate, okay, with resistance. We talked a little bit about it a couple weeks ago, but one way is for the plant to produce an excessive amount of this EPSP enzyme, okay, and that's how a lot of our weeds are getting around glyphosate. They just basically produce a 10x to 100x rate of that EPSP enzyme. And when they do that, then they get very, they basically are able to escape it. Now, with those type of weeds, we can sometimes get effective weed control yet if we do it early. Okay, so when the weeds are really small, but once they get past about 2 inches, and you can see them from the cab of the sprayer, it's too late. Okay, and we do have to get past this point, guys, of where farmers want to see weeds before they spray them. Unfortunately, if we're seeing the weeds from the cab of the sprayer, honestly, they're probably too big at that point already. Okay, you want them 6 inches or less, and if you have Roundup resistance, you want them 2 inches or less. Okay, and we want to have multiple residual activity type herbicides out there so you get a layered residual approach there. Okay, the other way that some of our weeds have overcome glyphosate is actually something like a mare's tail. Okay, and you've probably seen this in mare's tail. Mare's tail, what it will do is it will take that glyphosate and actively move all that glyphosate up to the very top of the plant. And that glyphosate will kill off the top of the plant, but then the rest of the plant survives and it tools out from the base of the plant. And really, mare's tail has done that. It's not even so much a resistance thing. Mare's tail has done that ever since we started spraying glyphosate on mare's tail. Okay, and so that's what makes that one a little more challenging. Adding something like a dicamba or 2,4-D in there can really help with that kind of control. Some of the key properties here that I'll point out, and there's a lot of the information on here, guys. We'll send out the slides. We're not going to spend time going through each and every section. I'll just point out a couple key factors here. Microbial degradation for glyphosate is very high. And so we do see that breaking down fairly quickly. Water solubility is high, but so is soil absorptivity. Okay, so it is very tightly bound to the soil particle. That's why we don't get any sort of root uptake. Soil persistence or residual is 0 to 12 months is what we expect there to be. And a lot of that's going to depend on how quickly this microbial degradation takes place. Okay, but glyphosate does not hang around in the environment for very long. As far as control here, you can see some of our key weeds and the control that you get. And as far as the adjuvant recommendations, we're going to want at least a quart of surfactant plus AMS. So my lead recommendation for that is going to be Class Act NG. Usually most people are using that at a 5 quart per 100 rate, which gives you basically about, let's see, you get basically with the 5 quarts, you're going to get some surfactant in there and some AMS. So, and then you're also going to get that corn sorb technology, which really helps with the absorption of that herbicide. And you can really see that in that video that we played just a little while ago. Okay, the next one we have is going to be our group 10. And there's been a lot of renewed interest around Liberty and glufosinate. Unfortunately, guys, I think for next year, glufosinate is going to be very, very tight. Okay, and so it's going to be key that we plan out the applications of this glufosinate. Don't be using it as a rescue, and make sure that we have that in the plan if that's the one that we're going to use, and make sure that we can get it into the shed and get it available. Part of the reason why this is short is because the plant that produces a lot of the Liberty, the plant itself didn't start on fire, but the one next to it did. And so it shut down production for a really long time. And so we're hoping to see some of that start to loosen up, but probably not for next year. Okay, so it's going to be tight this next year. And part of another reason why we're seeing the tightness of Liberty is due to the fact that we have so many crops now that are tolerant to it. Okay, so if you think of the soybean side of things, for example, pretty much all of the stacks that are coming out are now also resistant to Liberty. Okay, the mode of action is kind of complex for Liberty. What it does is it inhibits the activity of glutamine synthesis. So what this does, I'll show you, I'll send you this chart, which I know most of you guys just absolutely love crop chemistry. So I made sure to include this chart. But basically what this is doing, guys, is it affects the ability of the plant to convert nitrogen in the leaves. Okay, and this is important because if you affect the ability of the plant to go ahead and move and be able to convert that nitrogen over, what ends up happening is we get this buildup of ammonia. Okay, and that buildup of ammonia is what causes the death of the cell. Now, we often put Liberty or glufosinate in the contact type herbicide class. And it is truly a contact type chemistry, guys. I actually wish that glufosinate and glyphosate weren't so closely related, as in so closely developed as words, mainly because of the fact that they're so different when you have to spray them. Okay, with glyphosate, it moves, okay, in the plant, no problem. With glufosinate, glufosinate does not move in the plant. And so what you get with that is you have to get that plant completely covered. Okay, now what's interesting, and it's going to be kind of contrary to what I just said, but glufosinate will actually move in the plant. And the reason I say that is because if you apply glufosinate in the dark or when the plant is not actively growing, the glufosinate will move in the plant. The problem is it actually moves away from the site of action. And so in that case, we don't get very good herbicide control. And I'm sure some of you guys have dealt with that, where you accidentally applied it on a cloudy day, for example, or you got a little bit late in the evening and the plant wasn't actively growing anymore, and you don't get very good weed control. Okay, so this one's going to be absolutely critical. The hotter conditions that we can have, actually the more moisture that we can have, generally the better control we're going to have. Okay, also, and I had a fair amount of calls this year on this, guys. Make sure you're using the right nozzles for glufosinate. And we are going to spend some time and go through all of the different nozzles and talk through where each one of these fits. Guys, these my recommendation for most of your sprayers, and it changes based on your speed and pressure and all that, but my general recommendation is going to be to go with the flat fan XR nozzle, 20 gallons per acre. Keep the nozzle under 40 psi. That's when I've had the best control. Okay, I've had a lot of people come up and say, well, God, I want to use these dual fan nozzles. Dual fan nozzles, guys, in general are not bad. And in fact, they can give you pretty decent coverage. However, most of the dual fan nozzles that a lot of people are trying to utilize are actually true air induction nozzles. Okay, and what an air induction nozzle basically takes air into the nozzle and inserts the air bubble right in the center of the droplet. Okay, therefore making the droplet larger. And so they're using these air induction nozzles that are twin nozzles, thinking they're getting really good coverage, and they're not. Guys, every time you cut your droplet size in half, you actually get 8 times as many droplets volumetrically. And so it's really, really important to make sure that we get the right nozzle on that sprayer, because if we don't, you're cutting your coverage down by about 8 times for every time you increase your droplet size by half, or by full droplet size there. So make sure that we are getting the right nozzle on the sprayer, especially for spraying for Liberty. Okay, some other things: glufosinate does not translocate, so we need good coverage. Weeds must be actively growing as well. Okay, here is a great picture of how Liberty actually, or video of how Liberty kills the plant. Also, adjuvants make a huge difference with Liberty. So here's 3 pounds of AMS. Here's just Liberty. And then here's 2.5% volume for volume with Class Act NG. You'll also notice that Liberty has a much quicker kill time than what glyphosate does as well. So this is 5 days after application here. Here's 6 days. By the way, you'll notice just the Liberty didn't get very good control, right? The Liberty plus AMS did a pretty good job, but what concerns me is I'm seeing some green tissue yet that could come back. Okay, whereas the Class Act NG completely killed this. Now we do need to have that Class Act NG at the higher rate, that 2.5% volume per volume, to get enough AMS in that tank mix. Okay, you can use the 5-quart rate. The key is, though, you have to add in 1.25 pounds of AMS with that per 100 gallons to get enough AMS to count towards that load. Okay. Also, I can't stress enough, guys, having the right nozzle is absolutely critical. Okay, this is back from our answer plot, and I've used this photo many, many times. Here's a TTI nozzle at 110.02 with 20 gallons per acre versus an XR at 10 gallons per acre. Now, you might wonder, well, Tyler, you told us we need 20 gallons per acre, so why did you do it at 10 gallons per acre? The reason why is because I've had a lot of farmers, a lot of applicators tell me, well, you know, I'm not going to go out and buy new nozzles. I'll just increase my gallons per acre and that'll take care of the issue. You cannot overcome your nozzle and your droplet size by increasing your gallons per acre. And that's very apparent here. Now, even in this 10 gallons per acre, we definitely did miss some weeds. But actually, the next plot over here, we did 20 gallons per acre. And that one over here is completely clean. Okay, so nozzles, gallons per acre, really, really important to make sure we're getting good herbicide control. Okay, the activity that you're going to see this burning type effect. So you're going to see this necrotic type effect to it. With this, you're going to see this activity a lot quicker than what we do with glyphosate. Okay, this is going to be, you're usually going to start to see some activity within 3 to 4 days. And by about 5 or 6, you're going to know whether you got decent control or not. Liberty is fairly water soluble. It's also absorbed to the soil fairly quickly, or not very quickly here. You don't have much soil absorption. The reason why this one doesn't have much root uptake is because microbial degradation is fairly high. Okay, but this is also the reason why on the label of Liberty, we do have some plant back restrictions to certain crops that don't have that Liberty Link trait. Okay, now it's not very long. Most of them are a week, but I would recommend making sure that you're paying attention to those plant back restrictions. Okay, another note that I'll tell you on Liberty, I've had some people trying to push the window on Liberty and make applications later, especially in soybeans, later than what they should. Guys, I would caution you on that. A lot of people get away with it every year, and I understand that, but I've also been called out on calls where the farmer decided that they were going to make an application of Liberty around R2, and in the fall, the soybeans never turned. Okay, and so that's the risk that you have of applying Liberty too late in the season, is the fact that you can get a delayed maturity with that soybean. Okay, so I would pay attention to that. That R1 is the cutoff for soybeans for timing on Liberty. Make sure you're paying attention to that in season. Okay, here's some of the ratings that we have for various weeds here. I'm going to tell you that the grass control on Liberty is not great. Especially perennial grasses. Perennial grasses, it's very, very challenging to get control with Liberty. And I think the biggest reason we struggle to get control on grasses is because if you think of where the growing point is, the growing point is down in the whorl and it's somewhat protected. So we can very easily burn off the tops of the grasses, but it's hard to get the growing point. It's easier to get the growing point of some of those annual grasses that are small. If they're getting any kind of size to them, they can be tough. Now you'll notice one thing, we have volunteer corn on here, and I get questions a lot. Well, what do you think about, especially with the derecho last year, what do you think about using Liberty to control volunteer corn? It can be fairly good. You'll see that we have a good rating here. However, if you have any kind of size to that volunteer corn, that's when we really start to struggle with getting control with Liberty. So I'd be cautious there. And of course, it's got to be non-Liberty Link volunteer corn. You can't have Liberty Link corn there. So any of the VT double pros would not have the Liberty trait in them. Okay, so if you planted a Liberty, and I know some people that try to do that, they'll plant a VT double pro coming off the bean year, and then they'll go into smart stacks on the corn year and apply Liberty, and you can get okay control, but that volunteer corn has to be fairly small. Key with this one, we need to have at least 3 pounds per acre of AMS or 10 quarts per 100 of Class Act. You can also split the difference and do 5 quarts plus 1.25 pounds to 1.5 pounds of AMS. Okay, but we do see better control with this 10 quarts per 100 of Class Act versus the 3 pounds of AMS. Now, I will tell you guys, though, if you have really good conditions for Liberty, you're not going to see a whole lot of difference between 3 pounds of AMS versus 10 quarts per 100 of Class Act. Where you are going to see the difference is if you get on a little less ideal conditions for spraying Liberty. For example, if you're going a little earlier in the morning or a little later in the afternoon, when the plants aren't as actively growing, that's where we see the biggest difference. Okay, moving on. We're going to talk some about the Ppo inhibitors. This classification is an interesting group, mainly because there's so many different active ingredients that fit into this category. And some of them have soil activity, some of them do not. Okay, so if you look at things like Valor, things like, let's see, Sharpen, even Flexstar, they do have some, they do have soil, Spartan, sulfentrazone here. Those do have soil activity. Flexstar has some soil activity, guys, but I wouldn't claim Flexstar to have great soil activity, especially against something like a water hemp. Has great soil activity against corn the next year if you don't get it applied on time in the soybean or in the soybeans the previous year. However, we do have a little bit of residual control on Flexstar as well. Okay, but you can see some other ones in here. You got things like Valor, things like Sharpen, AIM, Resource, Spartan, which would be in the Authority products, or Sonic, Avalanche Ultra, Ultra Blazer, and then Cobra or Phoenix. And I see I have Phoenix spelled wrong. My bad. So there's quite a few that fit in this category. Some of them have soil activity, some of them do not. Okay, what it does is it interferes with the enzyme protoporphyrin oxidase, or PPO enzyme, which is important for chlorophyll biosynthesis. Okay, so without this enzyme, what happens is we get a buildup of free radicals in the cell. And when that happens, it basically ends up, those free radicals end up basically burning away the plant tissue. Okay, and I don't know, Darren probably went over a little bit on free radicals, but basically, guys, what it does is these free radicals and some of the chemistries that create these free radicals, those free radicals are electrons that they basically don't have anywhere to go. So they have all this energy, usually created by the process of photosynthesis. If they don't have anywhere to go, what ends up happening is they end up attacking things like the chlorophyll molecule. They end up attacking the cell walls, and you get this burning type effect. Some other ones that would do this very similar thing would be, for example, like our group 5s. Okay, and there is some reported synergisms between the group 14s and the group 5s. Okay, now very rarely do we see those applied together. And so we don't necessarily see that synergism very often. The only time that they're really applied together is when we're doing a something like a metribuzin with this. There is some benefits to having both of those in the tank, and there's definitely some synergism. Where we usually see synergism, and where I'm going to spend a little more time talking about it, we usually see it between the group 27s and the group 5s. All right, I had a question come in. Going back to spraying Liberty at R2 or later, actually it's anytime after R1. Obviously, it said that the beans have trouble reaching full maturity, but what do you see in relation to yield loss when spraying Liberty R2 or later? Is there valid yield loss? So the good question. So as far as the yield loss, the guys that had this happen, the beans never did develop anywhere on the top part of that plant. And so the beans that I walked yielded, I believe, about 32 bushels per acre. So there was a significant yield loss to doing that as well. Think of it, guys, I'll describe it this way. Have you ever had a area around, maybe you have a farm that or farmer that farms right along a roadway that has a lot of street lights along it, and the soybeans underneath those street lights never mature? It's the same type of thing that I had with this Liberty, except it's the whole field. Okay, and really anytime after R1 that can happen. This guy happened to apply it at R2. And I'm not saying necessarily that it will happen, because I've had lots of farmers that have done it, not seen any issue. But the complaint calls that I have been on, when it does happen, those soybeans never do mature. They have to wait for a frost to harvest, and there is a significant yield loss to having that happen. In this case, that was about 32 bushels per acre is all he got out of that field. So it was a pretty significant yield loss. Thanks for the question. All right, so the Ppo inhibitors, like I said, there is some synergism there. So you're starting to see some premixes come out. So for example, like Authority MTZ has both sulfentrazone and metribuzin in there. You're also seeing very similar things like Corteva just brought out their new herbicide. I'm blanking on the name. If anybody has it, just oh, what is that? I can't remember, but their new soybean pre there has that sulfentrazone molecule in there, along with, here, somebody's got it, Kyber. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, Kyber. So it's going to have that group 14 and the group 5 in there. There is some synergism between those. So you do get a little bit better burn down activity with them. And it's because of the fact that they act in very similar ways. If you have two different chemistries that cause, for example, the buildup of free radicals, even if they're acting on different parts of the plant, which they would because they're different active ingredients, that's the reason we see the synergism take place. Okay, so most of these we would consider to be called the burner type herbicides. They're also, if we're spraying them foliarly, they are a contact type chemistry. Okay, so you have to get really good coverage. Think of these like Liberty, use those XR nozzles. You're going to get a lot better control with that. Okay, some are taken up through the roots and translocated through the xylem. So think of things like sulfentrazone, so Sonic, Authority, those type of products. Valor, for example, would be another good example of the Ppo inhibitors that are taken up through the roots. Generally, these do have better control on broadleaf weeds, but we can have some effect on grasses. So for example, corn, I'm sure you guys have seen this before. You get this, this Venoclerosis on the plant. This is actually from a complaint call that I went on a couple years ago. What was interesting about this one, we had the hardest time coming up with why the heck we were seeing this pattern out in the field. You walk out in the field, I believe the farmer was actually blaming this on an Atrazine plus acetochlor application. He was saying that the co-op had misapplied that herbicide, and now he's seeing some damage. So we walked out in the field, and the first thing I told the guy, I said, this looks like Flexstar damage. And it was characteristic Flexstar damage. You can see the venoclerosis that we have. And this is a key characteristic, guys, because a lot of people think, they look at this and go, well, God, that kind of looks like zinc deficiency. The difference between this and zinc deficiency is with zinc deficiency, the in between the veins will be chlorotic. Okay, it's called intervenoclerosis. Whereas with a group 14, in this case, Flexstar, what you're going to see is the veins themselves will be chlorotic. Also, you remember back here, we did say that these are taken up by the xylem. They're xylem mobile. So anytime we have a xylem mobile herbicide, we do expect to see the damage towards the bottom of the plant first, and then working its way up. Okay, so that's going to be a key characteristic, and you can see that on these plants here. It's also going to be venoclerosis. Also, the leaves themselves are going to curl, and you'll see that very drastically here. Okay, you can see that really curling. Now you can see some of that damage here. What we eventually found out was because we asked him, when did you apply your FlexStar last year, all of this. What we ended up finding out, it had nothing to do with the sprayer application. He actually had some weed escapes, and the farmer's son had gone out and cleaned up those weed escapes with a 4-wheeler sprayer and FlexStar on January 30th. And so what we're seeing is every place that he did that 4-wheeler application, and of course with the 4-wheeler application, you just want to douse everything. So it's probably a pretty high rate as well, but it definitely carried over into the corn crop that next year. So we want to be careful with that. One thing I will tell you guys, because every year I have one area of my territory that shows up with some sort of FlexStar damage from a little bit of carryover. Guys, it takes a lot of FlexStar damage to actually cause a yield loss. And I can't tell you how many times that we've had this issue and brought it to yield, and there's been no yield damage. If the plant recovers by about V4, V5, you're not going to see a yield loss. Okay, so I'm not really concerned. Every year, especially in the overlaps, areas that they maybe the applicator turned a corner, you'll see a little bit of this, right? But as long as the plant recovers, I don't see much for yield loss from it. Okay, now obviously this right here is an extreme situation where there's going to be some yield loss, but most of the stuff that we're seeing, not going to be an issue. In fact, guys, we in our answer plots, we actually go out and put a full rate of FlexStar out on corn at the beginning of the season just to show symptomology. And I would say a majority of the plots end up recovering, and we don't see later on in the season, it's actually hard to see where we applied that herbicide. Now, I'm not saying go and do that, because we also have some plots that you get the wrong conditions, it'll definitely cause some severe damage. But just so you know, if you're seeing a little bit of FlexStar damage, it's nothing to get overworked about. Okay. I also had some farmers a couple years ago that we were seeing quite a bit of sulfur deficiency showing up. And of course, they were seeing that, oh, God, FlexStar is definitely causing the issues because everybody on Twitter sharing pictures of FlexStar carryover. Guys, sulfur deficiency shows up much differently than what, and so does zinc actually, than what FlexStar shows up. Okay. First of all, both zinc and sulfur will show up at the top of the plant. The bottom of the leaves will not be curled, and it will be inner venoclerosis, not venoclerosis. I also had one Pioneer rep try to tell me that the corn was lodging, his Pioneer corn was lodging because of FlexStar carryover. When we, so I went and investigated. When we went and dug up the roots, there wasn't much for roots left, but there was a whole lot of rootworm. So I'm not sure where they got the idea that FlexStar chews on roots, but there are a lot of things that can somewhat look like this, but this is going to be a very distinctive appearance. Okay. Another characteristic that you're going to see with these PPOs, they are a contact type chemistry. So wherever you hit on the plant, that's where you're going to get control. Okay. Now, I put this up here. This is just general characteristics. However, each one of these active ingredients is slightly different. So understand that these can change by active ingredient, but in general, microbial degradation is very high, and water solubility is fairly high as well. Also, quite a few of these can be sensitive to degradation as well. Some of them can, some of them aren't. And so some of them you have some soil activity, some of them you don't. Okay. Also, soil persistence, 0 to 12 months. However, things like FlexStar, for example, can last a lot longer. One word of caution, and this is true of a lot of chemistries, guys. if you have a farmer that plants alfalfa, whether it's a dairy or a cattle producers, any one of them, if you know that that farmer is going to be planting fields of alfalfa, plan out your herbicide programs 2 years in advance. The reason I say that is because, for example, with FlexStar, it's a 2-year, or sorry, it's an 18-month rotational interval to alfalfa. Okay, so big difference there on the alfalfa side of things as well. Another good example would be atrazine. And I've had a lot of people, especially not this past year, but the year before, guys, atrazine has a 2 cropping season restriction to go into alfalfa. Okay, and that's really, really important to make sure that we're getting that 2 cropping season. Now, does it show up every year? No. However, I have seen significant damage to that stand with atrazine. So definitely want to be careful there. Okay, here's just the ratings. These come directly out of the crop protection guide. Now, of course, this is based on non-resistant weeds, right? So water hemp, you can see certain ones have really good control, certain ones not as good. Definitely want to be paying attention to some of these. However, unfortunately, there are certain ones that have developed resistance. So especially with water hemp, we might not get as good of control anymore. Okay. Another thing, we do have a rule of thumb around some of these adjuvants. When we have a relative humidity and a temperature together equaling greater than 150, and this one uses 155, I use 150, we need to back off on some of the oil rates that we have. Don't take it out, just back off on the oil rates that you have in the tank. Okay, and this is true of a lot of herbicides, guys. We want to be very, very cautious when we get above 90, or when we give a relative humidity and temperature above 150 when you add those two together. By the way, it has to be both. I've had, especially this last year, I had a lot of people call me and say, hey, Tyler, you know, it's 100 degrees out here in the middle of the day. Should I be spraying corn or should I be spraying beans? Well, you look at the relative humidity and it's only 30%. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, it's the combination of both of those that's really, really important. I'll give you a great example. You go down in southwest of here, down into like Kansas and some of those areas, they use a whole lot more oils than we do, even though it's hotter, because their relative humidity is so low. Okay, they find that they need better control or better oils in the tank to get better control because of the drier conditions. By the way, this is also why we struggled to get volunteer corn control this year with some of our lower rates, especially without an oil, because of the fact that we had such hot, dry conditions. Puts on a very thick, waxy cuticle. Okay, so as far as adjuvant recommendations, you can see each one has a slightly different adjuvant recommendation, but most of these Ppo inhibitors are going to require a oil type herbicide. Okay, you need an oil in there to make these things work, whether it's crop oil concentrate or MSO. Okay, group 15s. There's quite a few in this category that are named. However, there's only 4 that are actually the active ingredients here. We have acetochlor, peroxysulfone, S-metallochlor, and dimethylamide P. Okay, those are the 4 in this category. Okay, and then there's quite a few different ones outside of that, or in the trade names and the premixes here. Site of action, this one is unique. Most of all of our other herbicides are either taken up foliarly or they're taken up through the roots. This one is actually taken up through the shoots. Okay, and the reason why this is important is because as you're taking up that herbicide, the herbicide has to be taken up through the growing shoot as it comes out of the ground. So if you don't have that herbicide active when it's coming through, when those seedlings are coming through that herbicide zone, you won't get control. And by the way, once the weed has fully emerged, it's too late for these group 15s. You will not get control. Basically, guys, what it's doing is it's inhibiting the long chain fatty acid synthesis. So basically, it's preventing you from producing a cell wall. It is one of the most widely used herbicides, used for grass and small broadleaves. Very effective on grass, fairly effective on small seeded broadleaves. We do have some records of resistance to, for example, S-metolachlor in some of the pigweed species. We are going to have to be careful with that going forward. They are taken up through the shoots, so moisture is really, really important. And we saw that this year where we had some issues with that. Now, this is actually a complaint call that I went on probably 4 or 5 years ago. Guys, very rarely do I see this. Now, this is what the ground looked like in the areas of issue. Basically, he got like a 10x rate of acetochlor out there. The rest of the field was at about V5, okay? But you can see that that herbicide was taken up through the shoot and caused some issues there, okay? Most of the time, I have people that send me pictures, hey, is this acetochlor damage? And they send me a picture of a plant that leafed out underground. Okay, guys, there's a lot of things that cause plants to leaf out of ground. I will tell you, if you have an acetochlor issue, you're going to see basically that entire field is going to look like this. Okay, it's not going to be 1 or 2 plants here or there that are affected. It's going to be all or most of the plants are going to be affected. Okay, I also, especially this past year, got a lot of calls on wrinkling soybeans here, that cobra head type look. People claiming that this is like dicamba or 2,4-D. This drawstring effect, I often call it like a heart-shaped leaf. This is caused by group 15s. And what you'll see with this is, especially as it's been dry for a while and then all of a sudden you get a rain, what happens is that group 15 reactivates and you get a little bit taken up through the roots and of soybeans in particular, and you can see this type of effect. You're probably going to affect 1 to 2 leaves, not going to have a yield loss, anything like that. You're going to affect a couple leaves, they're going to come back out, and you're going to be fine. Okay. With these are really going to depend on the chemistry that you're using. Some of these have a very strong soil absorption. Some of them are more medium. So if you think of something like S-metolachlor, for example, dual. Okay, S-metolachlor is very strongly absorbed to the soil particles, which is the reason why we need more water to get that one activated. Okay, is because of the fact that it's so strongly absorbed to the soil particles. Okay, as far as lipid synthesis, water hemp generally fairly good on. Velvet leaf and giant ragweed, almost no control because they're considered large seeded broadleaves. And then a lot of our grasses we do have fairly good control on as well. Okay, no adjuvant recommendations for the lipid synthesis inhibitors because we're not trying to get foliar activity. Last group here is the group 27s. Okay, so we got mesotrione, bicyclopyrone, isoxafluto, tembotrione, and topromanazone. Okay, a lot of these are in quite a few different premixes as well. A lot of these are actually fairly similar. They act very similarly. Basically, what they do in the plant is they indirectly inhibit carotenoid biosynthesis. by binding to the HPPD enzyme. Okay, so you might ask, Tyler, why does that make a difference? Okay, well, what this does in destroying these carotene pigments is that these pigments and these carotenoids are what protect the chlorophyll molecule from free radicals and from being attacked. Okay, it basically protects the chlorophyll molecules. So if you get rid of that and you're not able to produce carotenoids, the chlorophyll molecule immediately starts to break down and you end up bleaching the plant. Okay, that's why we call these the bleachers, right? You get this kind of effect to the plant. You're going to see this first in the new growth because that's where a majority of the chlorophyll is being produced. You're going to see that first there, and then it's going to move to the rest of the plant. These HPPD inhibitors do have a symbiotic relationship with the group 5s because of the fact that the group 5s create free radicals, and the free radicals then are not protecting, or the carotenoids are not protecting that chlorophyll molecule. So we do get some synergism between the group 27s and the group 5s. Okay. Herbicides in this family can be applied pre-emerge or post-emerge. Some of these are better off as a pre, some of them are better off as a post. Okay. This is the effect that you're going to see with this. You're going to get that bleaching type effect in that new growth first. Okay, and this is another key way that you identify the differences in herbicide damage out in the field is, okay, is the damage in the new growth? Is it in the old growth? For example, if I go out and I'm looking at a field and I see all the damage in the old growth, I know that it's probably either a group 14 or group 5 because those are taken up by the xylem. Where if it's in the new growth, I know that it's either group 27, 9, let's see, what else is group 4, quite a few different groups taken up that way. So key ways to identify what you have for herbicide damage out in the field. Okay, these, you can see they are fairly highly absorbed to the soil particle. They do have a little bit longer persistence, and this is where we really have to be careful, especially in going to alfalfa. Okay, a lot of these have a fairly long rotational interval in going to alfalfa, so we do want to be cautious there as well. Water solubility is medium. Part of the reason, guys, why they do last so long is because they have a medium microbial degradation and a low chemical degradation. So they do last longer in the soil than some of our other chemistries. We do have some resistance showing up to HPPD inhibitors. So as easy as we've had it at killing weeds in corn, guys, don't be cutting rates. Make sure you have more effective modes of action, because we don't want to lose this chemistry. Okay, you can see some of the weed ratings there for these various chemistries. Very good on our water hemp. Now, you might ask, you know, bicyclopyrone. Guys, I don't have ratings for this. I'm sure it's actually really good on water hemp, really good on giant ragweed. I know it's really good on giant ragweed and velvet leaf. It just, right now, it's such a new chemistry. I don't have ratings on that. So don't pay attention to that. You can see where some of the rest of these fit in. Quite a few of these have very good control on more of the small seeded. Some of the larger seeded, we have good to fair control, but it just depends on what you're looking at there. As far as recommendations for adjuvants, most of them are going to either require an MSO or a COC. Isoxaflutol, the reason there's none there, most of that's going out as a pre. If you do expect burn down activity on that, you're going to need some sort of oil in that as well. Okay, here's your adjuvants, and here's your CCAs. So go ahead and feel free to sign into that. Hold on one second.